Well, welcome to Permanent Excellence, and I'm joined by another fantastic guest. We've got world speaker, stockist, artist, trainer, Alice Kingdom here, joining me all the way from the deep south of England.
The deep south, indeed. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well.
I'm super excited to have you here. And there's so much that we can talk about because we do talk at length.
We do, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we've got lots that we could talk about. This might be the first of many, right?
I would absolutely love that because we do talk, we've got a lot in common. We hit it off as soon as we met. We actually met in America.
We
Um,
do.
but today I wanted to get you in to talk about something that I know that you're kind of very knowledgeable about, which is REACH pigments,
Mhm.
which has come in and changed everything, hasn't it? And I know that people say, oh, it's only EU, but actually it's changed pigments worldwide because
Yes.
a lot of big brands have had to get on board with this. So can you tell us a little bit about REACH and what it has meant to the pigments?
I can do. So reach, and I've written this down because although I am a geek, I do have to, I thought I should really know exactly what it means. So reach is the registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. And that came in, that's a law, really, a regulation which has come in the EU to look at all kinds of chemicals. So whether you're making paints or pigments, it covers everything. But obviously what we're really interested in for our industry is how it affects us and how it affects our pigments. So the prior regulation was something called REASP, and REASP was, don't ask me what that stands for because I haven't written that down, but REASP basically regulated and controlled what went into our pigments, and REACH has kind of taken that one step further. So what it's designed to do is it's designed to look at carriers, elements, preservatives, thickeners, all of the things that can potentially go into our pigments, and look at those that could be possible allergens, possible carcinogens, and say we don't want them in there anymore. And that's what it's done. So I think it covers, REACH in total covers about 20,000 different chemical things, looking at it from the outside. Um, for for pigments, there was specifically 21 substances that EU REACH has banned, and that ban came in January 2022. And that is, like you say, is just for the EU. So it doesn't actually affect the UK because of Brexit. We don't fall under that. So it is globally only affecting a very small area. But of course, pigment houses want to have the safest pigments possible. Artists want to have the safest pigments possible. And all of that feeds back to our clients, who ultimately is who we're working for, who also want to have the safest pigments possible. And so it's meant that a lot of changes have had to happen.
Definitely. I have had potential clients come to me and say, I am worried about carcinogenic properties in some of these pigments. I'm worried that something is going to happen down the line. And the EU, Europe has always been the safest of the sort of legislations of pigment.
Absolutely.
And most pigment manufacturers in the world have always kind of kept up to those standards, haven't they? You know,
They
because
have.
yeah.
They have. So if you look at a lot of pigment houses in America, for example, where the regulations aren't quite as stringent, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the pigments are not safe, it just means that the regulations aren't as stringent. And it's important that we don't get those confused. So it's not safe and unsafe, it's safe and safer still, is kind of what we're looking at. So a lot of the time, those pigment houses have always looked at what the EU is doing, or looked at what substances are potentially causing problems, and have removed those from their pigments anyway. This regulation has meant that they have had to. So previously, if you were using previously you could use whichever pigments you liked in the EU. Now you can only legally import and buy REACH certified pigments in the EU. But like we say, although it is just the EU that it's affected, it twigs the ears of pigment houses, because they know that we want to have the safest pigments possible.
And do you think that the likes of like the FDA, I know we're not in America, but like the likes of the FDA are then going to start coming in and start regulating things? Because I do think it is a little bit different across the board in America, even with regards food, additives. It's very much over in the EU. You need to prove it's safe, whereas in America, I think it's you prove it's
They prove it's not safe. Yeah,
prove it's unsafe. It's a
absolutely.
different way of coming at it.
I mean, the FDA is a huge animal, and a lot of regulations can sometimes, unfortunately, be money driven. So I don't know. I mean, that would be that potentially, I think, yes, at some point down the line, that may be a possibility. Where the FDA is in terms of pigment regulation, I'm not sure. And whether the pigment regulation that the FDA would come in would be as stringent as REACH, again, who knows? So it doesn't affect us in the UK at the moment. The UK did have an option to kind of piggyback onto the EU REACH regulations. And at a time, probably until about a year ago, that's what a lot of the pigment houses thought was going to happen, is that the UK was going to kind of bolt themselves onto EU and EU regulation. The UK have actually decided in their wisdom now that they're not going to do that. They are going to have a REACH regulation, but it's going to be called UK REACH. And it is slightly different.
Now, is it slightly different because it's slightly different, or is it slightly different because they just want to put a blue cover on it and put the UK and just say, oh no, we're just not being told what to do by Europe?
Well, we've become very good at that, haven't we, since Brexit, saying, well, no, we're not the same anymore, but we are, but just put something with a gold leaf and navy cover and we're absolutely fine. It is going to be slightly different. So for EU REACH, the bits that we were interested in as permanent makeup artists and people using or not using certain pigment elements and carriers and so forth, there were 21 of them that were banned, and they are mostly they're mostly yellows and reds. There are some blues and some violets in there which don't kind of affect us quite so much in permanent makeup as they would do in tattooing. In the UK it's going to be just 19, so it differs, but it doesn't differ enough that I don't think the pigment houses will be going out there and saying, right, we've got an EU REACH formula, we've got a UK REACH formula, we've got a RIASP formula, we've got this, that, and the other. It is pretty, I think it's pretty safe to say that most pigment houses will go with the EU regulation, and whatever those two elements are. I think those two elements, I think one is and I've not double checked this, but I'm pretty sure two of them are kind of pigment elements which are quite rarely used and don't really affect us anyway. So for all intents and purposes, it's going to be the same. And they're talking about that coming in probably 2026, 2027. Which sounds like a long time away, but it's actually really not.
Well, if you think about it in, say, eyebrow terms or lip terms, in lips, it's your next colour boost
Yeah,
for a lot of clients. And for eyebrows, what, 2 colour boosts away? And in which case, you're probably wanting to get familiar with the pigments that you're going to have to be using. And I think that this is, all the legislation aside, we kind of want to know, how does this affect us? How does this affect our work? Because let's say we're getting rid of a lot of things like iron oxide red is on that list, isn't it?
yes, it is one of the things on
so
there.
that's
Yeah,
gone. So
or
that's going
certain types of. Again, there are
yeah.
lots of different iron oxide reds.
Yeah.
So yeah,
But it is going to affect the long-term heals of certain results. Your results are going to be different because of that.
absolutely,
So
absolutely.
this is what I think that most artists are kind of like, all right, we all want to be safe, all of us. We want to give our clients the best. We've all got certain ways of working, whether we like things to fade a bit or whether to, you know, we've got our preferences. But how is it actually going to affect us with what we're allowed to use? I mean, tell us, what does I know there isn't a typical REACH blend, but did the
What does
EU,
it look like?
what does it look
what
like
does it
for
mean
our
to
pigments?
us? Okay, so to us, what it looks like is that most pigments are going to become a hybrid blend. So until probably only sort of recent pigment history, we've had very much your inorganics and your organics. With the REACH regulations, it means that there is going to be more of a blend. That blend needs to happen for stability, and it needs to happen because there are a couple of colours, there are a couple of pigment codes which just can't be used anymore. And so what does that look like for us? Well, it's kind of like someone taking your favorite spaghetti bolognese recipe that you've always used and getting you to make it, but with slightly different ingredients. And so it might taste and look and smell a little bit different. It's still a spaghetti bolognese, but it's not necessarily exactly as it was before. And that's what the pigment lines have been working really hard to do, is to create lines which have had these old elements that they might have been working with for a number of years taken away and a new element put in. So from an artist point of view, if you are working already with an inorganic line, you might see that inorganic line produce a new line, which is REACH certified. And that REACH regulated and certified line is going to be a hybrid. So it's going to implant a little bit easier. So if you're used to maybe already working with a bigger needle and putting a lot of saturation in, an extra layer or so, then maybe you might need to do a little bit less than you did before, but only marginally so. Again, this is the same spaghetti bolognese, it's just a slightly different recipe, okay?
Not a chicken
but there's a
katsu.
learning curve to that. Chicken katsu, yeah, if that's your go-to. It's still the same thing, but it's slightly different. If you, I mean, there is a big trend at the moment for a lot of people realizing how strong organic pigments can be. I think the industry got really overexcited about them 5 or 6 years ago when they first came out. They were generally a little bit cheaper to purchase. They flew into the skin really nicely. They looked great. They had gold shiny bottles and celebrities behind them. And then 4 or 5 years down the line, we've kind of gone, oh, well, we perhaps weren't, there's nothing wrong with those pigments, but perhaps we weren't using them in the right way. We were using them in an oversaturated way. And so we have to be a little bit aware if we're moving from an inorganic to a hybrid, that the same thing is going to be possible, not in the same way, but it's that element of carbon. Mm-hmm. So to dial back a little bit, that's what's happened, is a lot of these previously inorganic ranges now need to have the element of carbon to keep them stable. And so that might make them, it just makes them a slightly different animal.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I've always tried on this channel, on my YouTube and also on the podcast, to never be like, this is the best pigment, because to me, there is no best pigment.
There's no such thing. There's no such thing.
The best pigment for this artist with this machine and this needle for this client to get this result. All these things are available for us to use. We just need to know what beast we're dealing with, and then that way we can use it properly.
Yeah. And you're very right in terms of thinking about timescales with eyebrows, timescales with lips. I mean, you know, if you were to start using a new pigment line today, when can you really say that you know that line and that you know how it acts, how it ages, and how it heals? You know, if you're a busy artist and you start using that line today, you might not be seeing all of your color boosts for another year, another 18 months, 2 years in some cases. If you're not quite such a busy artist, then you're going to have even less of an opportunity to see those pigments age and change. And also, depending on what you do, I'm quite lucky that, as well as being a very busy artist, I have clients that come back to me for other treatments and other things that I do in between. So I'm able to see a brow at the 6-month stage and a year stage. They don't just walk in 2 years after and I'm like, hi Karen, how are your eyebrows? I get to see that progression, which is interesting too. So it's going to take a little while if people are changing, just to get used to that new recipe. But that's a very exciting journey, and there are some great ranges out there that have been formulated. You know, these changes for a lot of the pigment houses that really know their stuff, and the pigment scientists that have been watching this for a long time, have been testing and trialing these for a long time. Yes, of course, there are brands that have just whipped something out. There always will be. But a lot of brands will have really thoroughly tested and appreciated what taking out one element means and changing it with another.
Yeah, and they knew this was coming. They had time to work on this, but also there was a little bit of a bottleneck as well, because everyone knew this was happening. So all the big pigment brands in the world, there's only so many places you can send them off to be tested. And so
Yeah.
these have been years in the making. And I know that I've always been a big fan of LI for inorganics, and that has had to change, hasn't it? And that's, I know
Yeah.
that that's one that you're particularly familiar with as well.
It is. And really, I suppose I mean, I've been using hybrid pigments for about 8 years. And I took over one of the UK distributor partnerships when would it have been? About the same time we met in America. So
I remember being with you
early
going, yeah.
early 2023. Yeah, it's exciting. And of course, I took on their kind of classic ranges and their loaded ranges. And one of the things that they were super excited about was this EU line. And I thought, well, I've never used this EU global line before. And I really always like to put my money where my mouth is. I will never recommend something just because somebody's told me to. And I went away and started using them, kind of thinking they'd be all right. I would say all right. I mean, I love Li. They'd be Li. They'd be really good. They'd be what I was used to. They'd fit just in. They'd fit in all right, just where with my comfort zone and where they are. And they did. I was really super comfortable using them super quickly. The colours are beautiful. They implant a little bit easier than the classic ranges, which I've never struggled with implantation with the classic ranges. I love the classic range, but I know that it is something that some people do mention. But these are just, they're so smooth to go in, and the heels are gorgeous. So even though I wanted to like them, I'm really pleased that they lived up to the expectations, and that they're more than all right. And it's what I use daily now.
So
And
you've,
I'm ready. I'm ready for those changes when they come in 2027. I don't have to worry about it.
and also you've already got your clients used to that. You're
Yeah.
already ready, and you're already seeing your healed and aged work. So realistically, you don't feel that these new legislations have negatively impacted you and your work?
No, I mean, so they've just changed them. Is it a negative impact to have to sort of shake things up and change things? For some people, yes. I mean, I quite like that. I think that most of us at some point or another will have had a bit of a dabble with different needles, different machines, different pigments, because inherently we're creative, and we like to have a little bit of a play. But getting to know a new range and getting to really understand it and love it has been great. It's been positive. 100%. It's been positive. If I only had that range to use, which in theory at the moment I can use any of their ranges. In theory, if I was to move to France next week, and I could only use that range, I'd be happy as a little pig in a blanket. I would be, more than happy to use those. What am I seeing with my heels coming back? I'm seeing really stable heels. I think the worry for a lot of artists with hybrid colours is that element of added carbon. And there's been a lot of talk we're a lot more educated now with pigmentology than we ever were before as artists. Probably like you, when you learned, you were shown a colour wheel and that was probably it. Like, if that, you weren't really told the difference between inorganic and organic. These were what you were going to learn with, and off you went. And so I think we can be a little bit fearful of carbon now, especially because there has been so much talk of these organic carbon-based pigments being hammered into the skin and overused. But there is carbon and carbon. And what I mean by that is, when you're shopping for tomatoes for your spaghetti bolognese, you can have your mass-produced, quickly grown, tastes like water tomatoes, and you can have tomatoes that are sun ripened on the vine somewhere in Italy. And those two things are still tomatoes, but they're very different. And that's exactly the same with the pigment elements that are put into our products. So we can have carbon that comes from petroleum and things like that. We can have carbon that comes from much better quality sources. And also the balance of carbon can be quite different from one pigment range to another. So the LI global range is still mainly inorganic. It just has that carbon element for the stability and to meet regulations, rather than them being a rather than them having a high carbon load. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, because you're going to have hybrids, and those hybrids, even though you say they've got carbon in, it's like having a cup of tea with half a sugar in, or a cup of tea with 10 sugars.
Yeah.
One I'll be able to just about drink, and one like no. It's a very, very different thing. And so it's whether it's going to be organic leaning or or inorganic leaning.
I mean, I've got some interesting little things here, which I don't know if we have time, but just to give you an idea. So this is an organic pigment. I don't know how well that's coming up on the camera, but basically most of the element is down at the bottom. It's all sunk down in there, and it's pretty clear through the top. There's another one there that probably shows it a little bit better. So all of the pigment is down at the bottom. If I shake that up, you'll see that becomes kind of nice and like a pigment milkshake. We have a hybrid, which is somewhere in the middle. So part of the pigment will still be suspended in the water, but then we have the inorganic elements at the bottom. And then we have this bad boy, who is just a carbon base. I mean, it looks black, but it's actually not. And there's exactly the same amount of drops in there, but that suspension, the particles stay suspended in that fluid for a lot longer. And so you can also imagine the how that acts with colour fastness in the skin as well. If you have an organic pigment with a very small particle size, that colour stay in the skin is going to have more power than if you have your inorganic with a bigger particle size. So your hybrid will sort of sit somewhere in the middle or on a range. So the LI ones are kind of more up at the inorganic end, but there are still fractions in between.
I'm just going to pause us there at the end of that sentence so Nick can bring a client past. Nick? We just got to the end of the sentence. Well, do you want just to bring her straight in and past? That was great. I love your milkshake.
God, if you're going to be a geek, right? Have your pigment. You can't really see it on the camera, I don't think.
You can. It's picking it up. Yeah. So, because I didn't do my podcast in the lounge, I was like, no, I'm doing it fully branded. But so I'll just let her bring a client past. Thank you. You're very welcome. We're Pigment Central here, pigment podcasting. Have fun. So I also want to be really clear that we're not saying that any of those things are a bad thing. That heavy carbon will have its uses in some.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's knowing your tools and knowing how to use them. Coming back to my spaghetti bolognese, if I'm making spaghetti bolognese, I'm not going to put a big tablespoon of red hot chili powder in there and a can of kidney beans, because that's a chili.
That's why I'm not coming around for dinner.
That's a totally different dish. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with any of those elements, but it's really understanding what they are, how they work, and how that affects what you might be seeing in the skin. And I think that's coming back to what you were saying about there being no perfect pigment. There isn't a perfect pigment out there. Different pigments, different artists, different techniques, and different outcomes is what you'll get. But what you want to know is what you're getting.
Yeah, and absolutely, that knowledge is the confidence of giving you that ability to choose the right thing for the right situation. And this is what I think people are always looking for, that magic bullet, the best.
Yeah.
And I find it really frustrating. It's like, you have all these tools to use, just get to know them.
The problem is the getting to know them, and that does take time. It would be really, really great if there was if there was a list out there, and a lot of pigment manufacturers have them. She's blonde, she's got this kind of skin, use this. She's dark, she's got this kind of skin, use that. And they're helpful, but we can't rely on those 100%. That's all they are, is a tool. And you know, with permanent makeup, it's time on skin. Someone can tell you sometimes until you're blue in the face what you're going to expect, but until you actually do it yourself and go, oh yeah, that's exactly what happened, it's really difficult to tell. I mean, I got given a pigment brand which has got a high carbon loading as part of a competition a number of years ago. And I only used that line maybe on 10, 15 clients until I realised that I didn't like it. It wasn't for me. Had some ingredients in which I didn't particularly like either. And I can still tell those clients when they walk in my door now. I
Yeah.
know who they are because their colour is different to all of my other clients that I might have used Li on, or that I might have used Everlasting Brows, which is a hybrid pigment line, or that I might have used Hanami, or some of the other ranges that I've used on. I can tell. I'm not going to name the brand is. I think most people could probably guess. Don't go there. We don't need to. Most people can probably guess.
What I would say is that
And
people have in the past asked me and said, why won't you name the pigments? It would be really helpful. And I think the thing is I think it's always good to say what we find positive about things, but it can just be seen as bashing.
yeah.
And we don't need to do that.
No, we don't. We don't. So there are lines that I've learned from my own experience that for me are just brands that I don't particularly get on with. On the flip side of that, I have lots and lots of friends and artists in the industry that think that those same brands are wonderful. But they might use them in a slightly different way. They might dilute them a little bit more, they might warm them up, they might use a smaller needle, they might only use them on certain skin types or with clients that understand how that longevity is going to last in the skin. You know, if I use something with a higher carbon load on someone that's 21 years old, that skin is going to, in theory, desquamate and regenerate quicker than if I use that same pigment on someone who's 75. It's still going to be a strong pigment, and I'm going to use it very, very cautiously and very carefully, but it's probably not going to look the same in the skin after 3 years' time on those two ladies.
Yeah.
You know, the 75-year-old is living with that probably for the rest of their lives, depending on how long they live. And the 20-year-old might need a lot of softening or some removal, you know.
And the thing is as well that we need to take into the equation as well, us and our skill level, and are we heavy-handed? Are we, you know, I think I'm naturally as a person very heavy-handed. You know when I'm coming, you can hear my footsteps. You can hear me typing on the computer. Now I try very, very hard to be super light-handed with my work. But I think that it also depends on the weight of your machine. So these things need to be taken into consideration. That's why other people may get good results. And it's why we won't bash on this channel, because someone out there can be getting really great healed results, long-lasting results, and someone else can be carving that into someone's skin. And it's
and like you say, there is just no perfect pigment. You know,
yeah.
if there were, then you would be saying, hey guys, found it. Here's the Holy Grail, got it. Here's what we should all be using. But there is no perfect pigment because the skin's not perfect and it's not the same. It's not like painting a front door or a wall in someone's bedroom. That wall changes. We don't get the same result with the same pigment on the same person as the same artists. You know, you and I, Katie, could use the same machine, the same needle, the same pigment, and we'd still create very different work. Because we're individual artists. Something that is worth talking about is how some of these new hybrids act under laser.
Okay.
It's one of the things that that I will now always look at when I'm looking at a new line, is how that line acts under laser. I'm not planning on giving any of my clients work which needs laser removal, but I'm very aware that layer after layer of colour, year after year, and it might not always be myself as an artist that they come back to, that inevitably a lot of our clients are going to end up needing some kind of lightening or removal, whether that's with saline, chemical or laser. And so that would also be my advice to artists if they are looking at investing in new lines. Try and see what information there is out there about how they act under laser. You definitely don't want any of these brands that are leaving behind some of these crazy yellows.
That's
Um,
such a big issue. And that's another thing with one of the big brands that, again, we're not going to talk about for reasons that we've already stipulated, is that when you get carbon, generally will laser away quite
it
quickly.
will
But
laser away beautifully.
you've got carbon and titanium mixed in together, they generally cause quite a bit of mayhem together. And then I'm getting people that have, not from my work, but they've had laser and they got rid of the black. Then they had a different laser and got rid of the red. And then they're left with
Neon yellow. Yeah. I
yellow.
mean, I'm a big fan of saline removal. I'm not anti-laser at all. I think laser is absolutely brilliant, but I never invested in laser because I didn't have the space in my clinic. And salines always work beautifully for what I've needed it to do. And I now see I have a number of laser technicians in my area that refer their yellow eyebrows to me. So they're ending up having to come for saline or chemical removal anyway to get shot of this banana yellow underneath. And that particular yellow, I believe it's yellow 138. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that particular yellow does not act very well under laser, but it is one of the yellows which is allowed as part of the REACH stipulations. So if you have a pigment house that has swapped one yellow out and they've swapped it in for another yellow that doesn't laser particularly well, I mean, most yellows don't, but some of them are quite soft, then again, that's something to be aware of. I went off with my little color swatch to my laser specialist friend and said, "Can you test these for me and just check that they whip out of the skin?" Because I just like to know how the pigments are going to react. So for me, a year on down the line, I know that my heels are coming back nice and stable. I've got no funky purples or yellows or pinks or overly greys, and I also know that they act really well under laser. So for me, I say I'm happy.
That makes you sleep well at night because you can predict the
Does.
long-term outcome.
Yeah.
I was with you and I tried a brand that everyone was crazy about, and I did maybe 3 people, and I just went, that's not for me. I was pretty. And again, now I'm seeing the tide turn against that kind of pigment where they're all saying, "Oh, kind of wish I'd not done that," because it's coming. They're not fading. They're not fading, and they're not. And again, then you're thinking of the laser in. It's a long and arduous journey. And I've got to say that those few brows are the ones that keep popping back into my head.
Yeah.
Whereas the other ones, I'm like, man, I've seen that come back
Yeah.
200 times perfect.
But the pigment houses, that work for high quality and work for high quality safe pigments will always continue to do so. And I think that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to like the LI Global line, was because I know that even though they haven't been making a REACH pigment for years and years and years, they've been working with hybrids for years and years and years. So a lot of people will think that the LI Aqua range, which is their classic line, is purely inorganic, and actually it's not. They have got some pigments in there which are already a hybrid. So looking at their 30 plus years of experience, it was just going to be, it's a given that they were going to come out with something that was ticking all of the boxes, and they've done really, really well with that. Absolutely. Yeah, they've done good with it.
So where can people find you? And also you are stocking these pigments as well.
I am stocking those pigments. Yeah, I stock the LI Classic line, but I also stock the Global line. And I've put together a little starter kit because I think that is one of the things that that can be kind of confusing for people, is knowing where to start. People don't need 10, 15 different colors. You might need 3 or 4. So they can always DM me. They can always reach me directly. They are more than welcome to message you. I'm sure they'll message you and say, where can I get these pigments? But you can
I
reach.
will link them in the description on YouTube.
Perfect. So yeah, we'll get some links. We'll get some links for the starter kits. And my inbox is always open. I think that is probably one of the most frustrating things sometimes when we start a new line, is really knowing what colours to use, what colours to choose, what the favourite mixes are, how to use them. And a lot of the pigment brands can seem a little bit faceless. So if anyone out there wants some help, my inbox is always open, and I'm happy to chat and show you pictures of healed work, of fresh work, and give some advice to make that transition as positive as possible. And it should be. It's good fun. It's a good learning curve, and it's exciting learning a new pigment line. I think so anyway.
Good fun, and it's safe fun.
Yeah, safe fun. Good, clean, safe fun.
But this is the thing as well, and I love that you've done a little starter kit, because I get asked that all the time. People will, and I'm going to actually name LI here because they have like 20 million colors. And I think that people will hear, oh, it's a really good brand. And then they'll go and look at it and go,
Yeah.
like, you don't need all those. I invested in something like 20 or 30 colors, and then eventually thought, I just use like 5.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can see sometimes when I'm speaking to people on the phone or in my inbox and saying, right, what colours do I need? And I'll say, well, have this one. This one's for your kind of light browns. We don't really, I think a blonde is always a bit, blondes always want darker than blonde. So that having your most palest blonde is probably my least used colour. You need a light brown, a medium brown, a dark brown, and then something a little bit darker if you want to darken any of those up, and something to add warmth, which is probably going to be a yellow based modifier, yellow orange based modifier, and that's it. So when people then say, what about this one? I'll go, yeah, that's a nice colour too. And what about this one? Yeah, that's a nice colour too. But you don't really need all of those. You can get by with some staples. And I think that's why, if we look at some of the ranges that have been super successful out there as a whole, it's the ones that have just come out, like Monica
I was
Ravani,
going to
that have
say
just
Monica
come out
Ravani.
with 4 colours. That's it. That's all there is 4 colours, and that's really because that's all you kind of need. So yes, when you're looking at new pigment lines, really that's what you want. You want something which is going to cover your your blondes, but your blondes really are going to be dark blonde, light browns, something for your medium browns, something for your darker, and a modifier, and anything else in between. You can kind of mix, you can dilute. Dilution's terribly underrated as well, I think, for creating
Love a dilution.
other colors. You have something darker and you want it lighter, dilute it. It's going to be the same tone, but it's going to be lighter when it's healed. So yeah, don't anyone watching this that kind of is in a bit of a panic about having to change lines, there is plenty of time, and it doesn't have to be a painful or expensive experience to go through.
Sounds it. You've made me super excited about these changes. I mean, I've already sort of started changing because things are coming, and also I think I kind of like things to have a little bit of a kick to them sometimes. You're like, maybe we could just do with a little bit more, because with that carbon comes a little bit more power, doesn't it? A little bit more.
It does. So it's just the implantation, really. I just find that they go in a little bit better. My heels are stunning. My heels, I just all the time just think, oh, it means I get to have many more cups of tea and many more sandwiches, because when my touch-up clients come in at 6 weeks, I kind of go, yeah, we'll do a little bit there and we'll do a little bit there, and you're good now. I'm going to go and have a cup of tea and a sandwich. And so that suits me fine as well.
That's what we all want, isn't it? When we're not stopping to breathe or we. Well, that's been super informative, and I think that you've made people in this podcast feel happier about changes that are coming, because I think people do fear change, and they fear changing a line, and also people that may have been tempted to sort of like felt that something like Li was maybe too sheer for them in the past. There are different options available as well.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's just knowing how to get the best out of that product. So again, if anyone's used those lines before and they want some tips, I think a lot of people use Li because they really want, or use Li or use a different brand because they're stuck with what they're using at the moment, but don't necessarily know how to get the best out of it. So yeah, any tips, anything like that, my inbox is always open. If you've struggled before and you want to know why, or you want some tips, sometimes it is just getting that little golden nugget that can change absolutely everything.
Thank you so much, Alice. And what's coming up for you on the horizon as well?
So what's coming up for me? Well, as you know, I am the owner and organizer of the UK PMU conference. So depending on where you are in the world and when you're listening to this, our next one is April 2025. So I'm throwing myself fully into getting that organized and prepared over the next few months. And all sorts of bits and pieces. I like to travel and do conferences and training, so I'll be doing a little bit of that. Trying to get my YouTube up and running a little bit more. Yeah, rolling with it, Katie.
You are getting your YouTube up and running because I'm watching you. You are doing it. I'm seeing it happen. Well, I'm really excited for the conference. Most people that I was there with said it was their favorite one of the year. It was really, really well received. You did a fantastic job. And I can actually sort of trace relationships and things that have progressed forward from actually meeting people in person. So I would highly recommend that you go and see Alice at that conference. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much for the invite. It's been my absolute pleasure. I hope that your viewers find that useful. And as I say, any questions, I'm happy for people to reach out.
Perfect. See you soon.
See you later.